Okay. So today's daf is Yud Ches. Really, the second half of the daf and the first half of the daf could not be different. The first half of the daf is the finishing off of really the Masechta Chagiga that we all know and love, and then the second half is the stuff that we haven't fallen in love with yet. It's the Toma and the Tara for the rest of the Masechta. Yeah. So I want to spend most of the time on Yud Ches and Beis, which is really the beginning of the rest of the Masechta. Move through the first half of the daf faster, only because it's. Not that the second half is hard. It's just that it's unfamiliar territory for most people, myself included, and so I think it would be kedai to sort of try to move through Yud Ches a little quick. Yesterday we had brought three different drashas, three different opinions as to where we're going to learn out Tashlumin of Shavuos from. In the last one, Reish Lakish brought his drasha. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish went back and forth on how valid that drasha is, and therefore in that discussion, Rabbi Yochanan pointed out, Reish Lakish, you can't say that drasha because in that drasha implies that Chalamayid would be, he mentioned Chalamayid, he referenced Chalamayid being Asr in Malacha, and Reish Lakish didn't seem to be bothered by that, meaning it seems Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, no one was arguing that Malacha was Asr on Chalamayid. We coming from a cut know that anyways, you don't really need Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan to tell us, we know that you're not allowed to do Malacha on Chalamayid. All of the different exceptions that we spoke about, but there is an Isra Malacha on Chalamayid. So says the Gemara 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 lines from the top. Michlal, last word on the line. Michlal. Michlal de Travayu Sfir L'hu D'Chalu Shalmayid Aser B'Asiyas Malacha, which again is a very strange observation. Meaning we know that there's an Isra Malacha because there's an Isra Malacha. You don't need Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, and Gemara to remind us of that. But regardless, the Gemara uses it as not the best of segues to talk about the Isser Malacha on Chalamayid. Says the Gemara, Minani Mili, where do we know that Malacha on Chalamayid is Aser? Really, this Gemara belongs in Mayit Katan. Here it is in Chagiga. Says the Gemara. We're going to see on today's Amud, I think, somewhere between 4 and 6 different opinions, depending upon how you read the Gemara. Tanar Rabban, Es Chag HaMatzos Tishmar, Shivas Yomim. So now, technically, if you look at the Psukim, the Pasuk actually goes, Es Chag HaMatzos Tishmar, and there's an Asnachta there, meaning it's a comma. Then it's Shivas Yamim Teichel Matzos, right? So Chag HaMatzos should be Shomer, and then Shivas Yamim Teichel Matzos. So the drasha really here is ignore the Asnachda and read it almost like as if it flows all the way in. Es Chag HaMatzos Tishmar Shivas Yamim. Watch it for 7 days. The implication being that the Shmira, meaning Isser Malacha, exists for all 7 days of Pesach. Limid al Cholo Shalmo, which Aser B'Asiyas Malacha. Divrei Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yoshia learns that there's going to be an Isser Malacha even on Chalamayid from this pasuk. Rabbi Yonason says you don't need to come onto a pasuk. There's a Kal V'Chaimer Amrein Etzarech. Kal V'Chaimer Umarishon Ushvi Shein Kedusha Lifnei and Ulachreyan. If it's in the last day of Pesach, the days before and after those days have no Kedusha, and yet they are Asr and Malacha. Asr B'Asiyas Malacha, Chol Shel Moyed, Sheyesh Kedusha Lifnei and Ulachreyan, where those days, Chalamayid, have days that they bookend. Right, the first and last day of Yontiv wraps around Chalamayid. So Chalamayid itself is in between the two mountains of the bookends of the Yontiv. So therefore, Einoi Din Sheyeh also B'Asiyas Malacha. A little bit of a difficult Kal V'Chaimer to hear. You can ask many pirchas on the actual Kal V'Chaimer, but the Gemara wants to use it as a raya. And I'll just point out, remember when we were learning the sugyas of Chalamayid and the Isser Malacha, we discussed that there's a big like showing whether there's an Isser Deraisa or Isser Derabanan. That was what's discussed then. And so here, if the Gemara is discussing Psukim and Kal V'Chaimers, which are all Deraisa level things, Tosfos here points out that obviously, according to Tosfos, let's say that it's only an Isser Derabanan. These are all smachtas, and that's why I think the Kal V'Chaimer doesn't have to be as strong. Really, the Gemara just means to use it as we're just a peg. We're just hanging it on this pasuk or this Kal V'Chaimer, but really it's only Mid'Derabanan. If you hold it to Deraisa, I think you could start asking better questions over here. But either way, the point is, Rabbi Yonasson's arguing you don't need a pasuk to teach me that Chalamayid is also b'malacha on Pesach. You have a Kal V'Chaimer. So the Gemara says, 1 second. What's the Kal V'Chaimer? You're telling me that because those days Chalamayid are wrapped by Yontiv, therefore they should be Asr Malacha as a Kol Shekain. Very weak. Says the Gemara, I'll prove to you that that's not the case. Sheish Shemei Breishis. Sheish Shemei Breishis, meaning basically every day of the week is not Asr Malacha. Yechich will prove to you that that's not a factor. Sheyesh Kedusha Lifnei and Ulachreim, because you got Shabbos. You got Shabbos, and the days in between is really exactly the same as a Pesach. The first and the last day of Pesach, it's almost exactly the same. Instead of 7 days in between, instead of 6 days in between, no, it's the same thing. No, it's 5 days in between. You have 5 days in between Pesach. You have 5 days of Chalamayid, and we have 6 days during the week. But regardless, the 6 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays, they're not Asr Malacha. So they're Umatar B'Asiyas Malacha. So therefore, don't say to me that Chalamayid should have that same status. As the Gemara, Mal Sheish Shemei Breishis, Shein Ben Carbon Musaf. Well, no, I'll tell you, maybe Chalamayid has two milas. It has the mila of requiring a carbon for the carbon musaf, plus the fact that it's wrapped around to Yom Tov. Therefore, that's the reason why it's also been malacha. Mashein ken sheish mebreshus. We're not bringing any musaf during the week. Says the Gemara. Sorry, Tomer b'chalosh almaya sheish be'carbon musaf. So the Gemara says, well, no, I'll prove to you that having a carbon musaf on its own doesn't really do anything. Why? Because look at Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh sheish be'carbon musaf from mutar b'asiyas malacha. Right. So now the Gemara could simply say over here, well, what do you mean? Rosh Chodesh is missing being wrapped by other two Yom Tov. The Gemara points that out. However, the Gemara gives a different answer. Mal Rosh Chodesh ein kari mikra kodesh. If you look in the Psukim, there's nowhere that Rosh Chodesh is referenced as a mikra kodesh. Therefore, since it's not called a mikra kodesh, therefore it's not going to be asar in malacha. Ma'ashein kein tamer b'chalosh almayit shekari mikra kodesh, and therefore hayalu kari mikra kodesh din hu she'asar b'asiyas malacha. Okay, so what we basically just in one long way said is there's a machlekes that there's an isar malacha on cholamayid. The drasha coming from Rabbi Yoshia is just a pasuk, no kashas on the pasuk. Then there's a kal v'chaimer. We went back and forth in the kal v'chaimer. In the end of the day, the kal v'chaimer works, and there's an isser malacha on cholamayid of it seems Pesach. Now, how do I know that that's true by Sukkot? So second, that Tanya Yidich that Rishonim speak out here is not arguing on what the makar for the isser malacha and cholamayid is. This Tanya Yidich is coming to teach us by Sukkot, and really that's it. It's chusas Sukkot and it's Pesach, and then you're good. Says the next bride. So Tanya Yidich kol melechas avoda lo yisa'asu. So here also you have to read the pasuk inside. The pasuk says as follows: "By Yomi Rishon Mikra Kodesh Kol Melechas Avodah Lo Sasu," and the next pasuk is Shivas Yomim Takrivu Isha Lashem. So really, the two pasukim have nothing to do with each other, but they're really unrelated. One ends the pasuk and starts the new one. So here too, we're going to do a similar thing. We're going to ignore the sof pasuk of the first one and sort of read it creatively to say, meaning you're going to read the end of the pasuk into the beginning of the next pasuk as if it's to say that there's no malacha to be done for all 7 days, which again teaches you, says the Gemara, limit al chalosh almayed she'asiyas malacha, and this is divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Now this pasuk is going by Sukkot. So the first drasha that we brought Rabbi Yossi was by Pesach. This drasha of Rabbi Yossi Aglili is by Sukkot, meaning each one of them are going to borrow each other's drasha to get us to the point where, at least if you hold it's min haTorah, you have a drasha from Sukkot. Says Rabbi Akiva, I have a different shot. Rabbi Akiva, you don't need that drasha and that pasuk, meaning you don't have to get creative in that way. You have a beferish pasuk says Rabbi Akiva. Arehu Oimer, the pasuk says, and this pasuk is also by Sukkot. Eile Moyadei Hashem Mikra'i Kodesh Asher Tikru Osam Moadam. Right, these are the holidays of Hashem. Mikra'i Kodesh. That's the line that matters over here. What does it mean that something is going to be called a Mikra'i Kodesh and therefore it's Asar b'Malacha? Kodesh Kedusha means something's Asar. Yeah, says the Gemara. What are we talking about over here? Which days are we referring to? Which days of Sukkot? In Berishon, if it's talking about the first day of Yom Tov, meaning the first day of Sukkot, Harek Farnamer Shabbos, and the pasuk later in that pasuk says the following: it says Chag Hashem Shavas Yomim by Yom Harishon Shabboson uVyom Hashmini Shabboson. So it already covers the first and the 8th day. So says the Gemara, what's it talking about? Harek Farnamer Shabboson. The im, and they change the gears here from Shvi because there's no Isser Malacha on the 7th day of Sukkot, right? Shana Rab's not also Malacha. If it's talking about Shmini Atzeres, right? Im b'Shmini Harek Farnamer Shabboson, meaning Shabboson is mentioned by both the first and the 8th day. So therefore, I already know there's an Isser Malacha already. So what does it mean when it says Mikra'i Kodesh, which tells me that there's an Isser Malacha? What's that talking about? Says Rabbi Akiva, Ha'ena Kasem Medabre Ala B'Chalosh Almayit L'Lam D'Chasha Asa Asiyas Malacha. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva argues. So that's going to be really either a third or a fifth, depending upon how you count it. Right? The first drasha was two svaras were for Pesach. These two drashas. Then the next two were for Sukkot, and Rabbi Akiva is adding on for Sukkot also. So that's really technically 5. Depending on how you combine them. Tanya Yidich, a third brayso. Sheishes Yomim Toichel Matzos, Uvayom Hashvi Aseres LaHashem. So again, over here you have a pasuk. Sheishes Yomim Toichel Matzos. For 6 days you shall eat matzah. Uvayom Hashvi, on the 7th day, Aseres LaHashem. It's either a meeting place for Hashem, but really Atzeres can mean Atzira from Malacha. Don't do Malacha, LaHashem, Lokecha, Lo Sta'ase Malacha. So how do you understand this pasuk? Ma Shvi'i Atzer. What does it mean? Sorry, let me just read that again. Ma Shvi'i Atzer, just like the end of the pasuk, talking about the 7th day, says Atzer. So too, the Sheishes Yomim Teichel Matzah says before it, Av Sheishes Yomim Matzuri, to tell you that all the days are going to be Atzer b'Malacha. Ima Shvi'i Atzer b'Chol Malacha. If that's the case, why not say that just like the 7th day is Atzer in all Malacha, meaning like Mamash Day of Yontif, Av Sheishes Yomim Matzuri b'Chol Malacha. Maybe say Chalamayid. It should just be 7 days of Pesach, one day after another of Yontif, and there's no Chalamayid. No Chalamayid trips. Talmud Leimer pasuk says no. Uvayoim hashvi'i atzeres. I skipped the line. Yeah, no, I got it. Talmud Leimer ubeyoyim hashvi atzeres hashvi atzer b'chol malacha ve'in sheishes yom matzur b'chol malacha, meaning specifically yom hashvi.
But some
are right. The beginning of the drasha tells me that all days are also malacha. The end of the drasha tells me that it's going to not be like the seventh in the sense that there's a limit on how much malacha is aser. In which case, what is that? So this, as we learned in the Sechta Meit Katan, is ha loy maser nakatzav ela lachachamim. Defining what's aser and what's mutter. On chalamayid was left to the chachamim to choose. Loy melach eza yom aser ve'eza yom mutter, and also eza malacha asura ve'eza malacha mutaris. Okay, so lemaisa maskana of this Gemara basically really was a tangent of a tangent. But we're discussing the source for the Isser Malacha on Chalamayid. The first, we had the Machlekes Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Akiva. No, Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonasan, whether it was from a Kal V'Chaimer or a Pasuk in Pesach. Then we had a Machlekes between Rabbi Yoshia Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, and I forget who, Rabbi Akiva and another drasha, whether it's by Sukkos. And then we had another drasha that's also talking about Sukkos, talking about Pesach. So we ended up with six drashas. Regardless, if it's the Rice, the Rabbanan, different opinions. So again, what?
But we came out less. The first couple of them were telling us that it's from Chamamish.
No, also all of it was all. Yeah, all of it was all just Chalamayid. Just the Nasan B'Yad Chachamim. It's just the question is, where is the drasha coming from? I mean, I guess what you're saying is you can ask the question.
How do you know that
the other malach isn't extended completely?
The other, only the last one
does that, right? Correct. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's continue. Remember the mission.
It's serious day.
It's there's like a machlokes here, right? Whether or not you could do.
So it doesn't seem there's a machlokes whether you can do it or not, but there is a machlokes whether what the Gemara is discussing here is the Raisa or the Rabbanan. That we saw in Chalam and Meit Katan in the beginning of the Masechta. That's it's machlokes we're showing them. Is the Isser Malach on Chalamayid min Torah, or is the entire concept only the Rabbanan? Yeah, meaning if it's the Rabbanan, and this is all the Gemara just trying to explain. Which this Gemara is a pretty strong raya that it's the Raisa.
Wow.
You read this Gemara, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah. Tosas speaks it out. The long Tosas over here, he goes through it. Wow. Either way, so we said in the Mishnah, we have Tumatara Number Beis. I want to get to it. So it says the Mishnah. Remember what the Mishnah said was that when Shavuos fell out on Shabbos, if you remember, so Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree, since you can't bring any of your karbanos up on Shabbos, because Shabbos we don't say you're allowed to bring your private karbanos. Therefore, everyone agrees you do your Chagiga and your Re'iyah on Sunday. Now that's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is the Tzdukim. The Tzdukim they only hold up Torah Shebiksav, not Torah Shebal Peh. Therefore, they, unlike us, when they're crafting, when Shavuos should be, right? Shavuos is 50 days counted, Mimachar Shabbos from the day after Shabbos. They understood it literally to mean after the Shabbos, after Pesach, you start counting 50 days, which by definition always means that Shavuos, according to the Tzdukim, fell out on a Sunday. So it's always the 50th day after Shabbos. So you start counting 1 on a Sunday. So that means it's 1, it's 8. So when you get to 50, by the time you get to 50, you're holding on a Sunday. So therefore, we would always be very careful whenever we would have to deal with Shavuos and Sunday together to try to do something to make it obvious that we're not acting like it's Tzdukim. So what the Mishnah said was that when we are doing the Chagiga and the Re'iyah of Shavuos on the Sunday after, we don't want the Tzdukim to be like, oh, look at those guys over there keeping what we said they're doing. It must be that's right. We don't want other people to think that we're making a mistake. So we would treat the day strange. Either we would tell the Kayan Gadol to not dress in his appropriate manner. Not when he's doing the Avodah. When he's doing the Avodah, he has to wear all 8 of his Big Day Kahuna. But specifically, when he was maybe walking around town, he wouldn't wear his finest Yom Tov clothing. It's different there. And the other thing that's mentioned over there is that although normally you're not allowed to fast, you're not allowed to eulogize the hesped on the day after Yom Tov. Isru Chag is normally Aser. They would say specifically on that Sunday, when that would happen, on that day you could. Now, the question is, says the Gemara, off of that, Vahatanya, they changed the gears here for a Bryce. The Bryce says, Maisa Umeis Alexa Belud. Alexa Belud died. You got to call Jeff Bezos, tell him Alexa's dead. Yeah, and Alexa's a man, obviously. Umeis Alexa Belud. V'nichnesu kol Yisrael l'safto. And they went, all of Klal Yisrael went, apparently he was a very chashuv person, and they went to go be maspid him. So the assumption over here is it was on a Sunday, and as the assumption is, it was on a Sunday like this scenario, where they had pushed it off to the Yom Tavoach, which was what that day was called, and they would go on that day. And really the halacha is you should be allowed to be maspid in order to make it out like it's Tzdukim. And Reb Tarfon said, don't do it. Because it's the Yom Tov of Atzeres, meaning it sounds to me like, now says the Gemara, Yom Tov, does it actually mean the day of Yom Tov? No, that can't be. Yom Tov Mikasa. No one's going to be maspid and going to a hesped on Yom Tov itself. And everyone knows you're not allowed to do hesped on Yontif itself. Therefore, it must mean, what does it mean? Like we just described, in which case then it's a kasha in our Mishnah. Now, for Tarfon Zatana, he could really argue on the Mishnah, who says he can't, but I guess the Gemara doesn't want to make unnecessary machlekes, and therefore we assume that when Tarfon said that it's aser b'tanis, which is not like our Mishnah, it's a kasha. Says the Gemara like kasha. Kan b'yom t'shechal liyos achar Shabbos, meaning the din, this statement we just learned from Reb Tarfon is not talking about the classic case where it falls on Shabbos and the Yom Tevoach is that Sunday. It's talking about, let's say, during the week, where at some point Shavuos fell during the week, and you're talking about the day after Shavuos, the Isra Chag of Shavuos, where that's going to be usher. There's no reason to make it mutter, and therefore Reb Tarfon was just saying, don't do hesped on that day. And and here is talking about our Mishnah back to the same din that we learned before. Okay. Your timing could not be better. So we just finished Yud Ches Amud Aleph. Yud Ches Amud Aleph is the end, really, of the sort of more well-known halachos of Chagiga and Re'iyah and all this other stuff. We're flipping over to Yud Ches Amud Beis, and we're starting with a Mishnah, and we're going to be discussing a little bit Tumah and Tahara. I just want to give a brief Hakdama. It's really a Hakdama for today's daf, but it's going to be important for the dapim that we go on, and we'll remind the halachos as we go. So, I'm starting from first principles here, right? So, Tumah and Tahara, what is it? Tumah and Tahara, they're psukim in the Torah. We talk about them all the time. We mention them as we come across Gemaras. There is a whole seder of Shas called Taharos, and in those Masechtos you have Olos and you have tons of stuff. Yadayim, Machshirin, all of these different sugyas of Tumah and Tahara. Now, Tumah and Tahara are a chok. The Rambam says it's not something that you can see. It's a spiritual reality. Generally speaking, it exists whenever there's a loss of life. Generally speaking, a nida, a yoledes, even a yoledes, the life leaves her body. She becomes tamei. A zav and a zava are also either a woman bleeding blood or a man having either a seminal emission or some type of an emission from that part of his body. Obviously, a tamei mace. Shrutzim is another type of tumah. The 8 shmona shrutzim that are tamei when they die. And a vela of an animal. You're always talking about tumah, and it's at least peripherally related on some level to death. Right, so the understanding basically is that wherever you have those types of things, you're going to have some type of tumah. What is tumah? The English language is very, very limited in its ability to really translate it. So unfortunately, it's been translated as impure, and therefore, menstruating women get the bad rap. But really, it's not an impurity or some sort of a problem. It's just a consequence of the lack of life. So it's just it's a state. It's the status, exactly. So now, understanding that status and where it comes from is important, right? So we'll start first with understanding that. Let's do it this way, right? So the primary relevance of tumah, although we think of it as like a concept or like a status, like you're saying, Cal, the real effect of being tameh is much more relevant to Beis Hamikdash. Meaning, when the Beis Hamikdash was Kayim, so the halacha was a tameh, a person who had tumah on, meaning if they had a status of a tameh, they were not allowed to go into the Beis Hamikdash. They were not allowed to eat kodshim, right? And not only that, but they weren't allowed to eat truma if you're a Kohen. And even chulin, regular food, which you're allowed to eat if you're tamei, or if the food is tamei, there were prushim, there were special people who were makvid, I guess their version of Chalav Yisrael, they would not even eat regular normal food if they or the food were tamei. So it was really important to prevent tumah from coming upon you. According to some Rishonim, it's actually usher to make yourself tamei. But regardless, tumah and its relevancy is significantly more important for Kodshim, for Hegdish, for Beis Hamikdash. Now,
food can people be tamei, or you think food can be tamei?
We'll get to that. We're going to do it step by step. So now, if that's the case, so basically that means that tumah has to first have a source, right? So and that source of tumah can come from a lot of different places. So I mentioned some of them before. Those are all referred to as an av hatumah. Now, there's one exception called an avi avos hatumah. That's like the grandfather of tumah. That's a dead body. But effectively, the way you need to understand tumah is that tumah can transfer from one, and I'll just use the word item here, and I'll clarify in a minute, from one item to another, right? And every time it transfers, it's sort of like Shabbos and cooking a tea or coffee. There's kli rishon, kli sheni, kli shlishi, and each time it moves, it lowers its potency, so to speak, yeah? So you start with the source at its highest. So let's use a tumas mace, a dead body, or part of a dead body. That's an avi avos hatumah. Tumah can transfer in a lot of different ways. It can transfer through touch, through carrying, through walking on it, sitting on it. It can transfer by being in a room with it. But we're going to talk about touching. It's the easiest one for our minds to wrap. And whenever we need to veer off and discuss another method, we'll do it. But let's try to talk about touching to start
Where
with.
did we learn this already?
Psachim. Psachim is the main place. And again, it makes sense. Anywhere we're going to be discussing karbanos, you're going to have sort of like a back pocket tumah conversation, because in order to do kachim, you have to be tahor. So and why is it over here in Chagiga specifically? The Rashi over here and says it's because at the very end of the Masechta, we'll show how there are some kulas that exist on Yontiv that don't exist in other places for these halachas. But really, that's not the reason it's here. Really, it's just an asmachta. We're just hanging it on that. Really, it's you got to find a place for it, because there's no actual Seder Gemara except for Nida. There's no Seder Gemara in Taharis. The entire Mishnayos of Taharis is just Mishnayos. There's no Gemaras on that. The same.
How come we want to go over this?
Yes, in Masechta Pesachim, in Mayat, we had a whole section, because in the middle, all those middle prakim discussing the Carbon Pesach, you needed to be able to eat your Carbon Pesach B'Tahara, so that you shouldn't have to go through the Carbon Pesach again, Pesach Sheni. But okay, so over here it's a little bit unrelated, but the Meiri says other reasons. They say just because since you're going to be eating your Re'iyah, you're going to be eating your Chagiga and your Shalmei Simcha, also it's relevant here. But either way, so Tumah can transfer in many ways. We'll keep the conversation limited to touch. Touching Tumah, or Tumah touching Tumah, so that can transfer. And again, the transfer goes, every time it touches something, it lowers itself down. So just like there's no such thing as a Kli Revi'i in Hilchos Shabbos, right? It's Rishon, Sheni, and Shlishi. You can then take that cup and pour it 1,000 times. It's still called a Kli Shlishi. In Halacha, we don't treat it any differently. You cannot make the fourth one cook even less, right? So too in Tumah, there's a limit to how many lines down it goes. So we'll start with the dead body, because that's the highest level of Tumah. That's the Avi Avos HaTumah. That can make something else an Av HaTumah. What's an Av HaTumah? Equivalent to the other ones I mentioned. The Zav, which is a man who has an emission, not a seminal emission, another type of an emission, like a gonorrheal or something like that. Or a Zava, which is a woman having her blood, but not during her menstrual cycle. Or a Nida, when she's having the blood during her menstrual cycle. A Mitzora, a person who has a lesion. There are many other examples of tumah, but these are sheretz is an avatuma, a nevela is an avatuma. The nevela is if an animal, a kosher animal, is not shechted properly, or if it's just shot in the head, that animal is tameh. So now that's an avatuma. There's avatuma
It's a kosher animal.
only if it's kosher
Only
animal.
if
Yeah,
it's
treif animal does. Well, that's another thing we'll get to in a second. Tumah exists specifically when there's a loss of life. The holier that thing is, the more tumah exists. Right? That's why, for instance, a woman, when she gives birth to a baby boy versus a baby girl, the days she must wait to become tahor in certain capacities for a girl is longer. Why? Not because girls are holier than men or men are holier than girls. It's because a girl contains within her the ability to give birth, which means she has more life in her than a man. And therefore, when a baby girl is born, there is more tumah there. Why? Because you've lost more capacity for life, right? And it's just more of about machshava of it. But the point is that the higher the kedusha of the thing, the more tumah can exist, which is why there's no tumah by a guy, or there's no tumah by a behemoth that's not a kosher animal, let's say, which is what Cal was mentioning. So
There's no tumah there at all.
and the sheretz also only those 8 shratzim, other shratzim not, meaning it's specific. Not that's the one
Non-Jewish
exception.
people are not they don't.
Not min haTorah. I think with the Rabbanan there are certain.
Well.
Yeah. So now, okay. So far, so good. Now, the next step is, so what we're understanding is that as you go from one level of tumah to the next, as it transfers, so there's a reduction in the severity of the tumah. And depending upon what the item is, how holy that item is, it'll be more or less susceptible to tumah. So let's just work that through. So you go from an avi, avos tumah, to an av, from an av to a rishon to a sheni, shlishi, revi. Once you get to revi, meaning each one of those things we'll talk about touching, once you get to revi, that's like a kli, shlishi, and bishul. That's it. Meaning, if something that's a revi'i l'tumah touches something else, it's nothing. There's no tumah left in the tank, right? So try to imagine that this spiritual force exists in its most potent level in a dead body, and then at its second most potent level would be an av hatumah, and then each point that it touches the next thing, it loses a little bit of its tumah to the point where when it gets to that fourth level, at that point there's nothing left. The next thing it touches, no tumah is transferred. Now that train that I just sort of laid out is true for only certain holy things. Because again, try to imagine, the holier something is, the more vulnerable it is to tumah, right? Makes a lot of sense. You take a very fancy, expensive watch, you don't just toss it on the table when you come home, it goes back in its little box. It's very vulnerable. You don't want it to get damaged. something that's very holy, like Kodshin or like Truma, they're much more susceptible and vulnerable to Tumah. So therefore, not only will they become Tameh if they come in contact with a dead body or an Av or a Rishon, they'll even become Tameh when they come in contact with a Sheni or a Shlishi, or perhaps even not. They won't become Tameh if they become in touch with a Revi'i, because again, there's nothing after Revi'i, but they may even become a Revi'i L'Tumah. So the way it goes is like this. There are three categories of things that can become Tameh to begin with. Adam, people. Kalim, vessels, which includes clothing. That's the place where it usually comes up most relevant. And then the third category is Ochlin Umashkin, food and drink. Which, by the way, we'll get to it hopefully at the end of the day today, is where washing for bread comes from. And we'll explain at the end of the today's daf exactly how we maneuver ourselves to get to the point where we are washing for bread. What does it have to do with this? Okay, that's called foreshadowing. That's I forgot the thing called when they say someone's gun. When you have a movie, you don't bring out the gun unless you plan on using it at the end. That was my attempt to hopefully get to the end. And at the end of the Gemara today, we'll talk about why we wash for bread. Okay, so Rostov's gun, I forget his name. Either way, so it says, so the halacha goes like this. When you go from an Av to a Rishon, that can happen on all three of those categories, right? So let's say Adam, Kalim, and Ochlin Amash can come into contact with a dead body, which is an Aviyavos Tumah, or a person who's a Zav or a Nidar or Yoladis. We'll just talk about a Zav to make it. So a Zav touches another person, that person becomes a Rishon. Touches Kalim, the Kalim becomes a Rishon. Touches Ochlin Amashkim, that becomes a Rishon. Now, what happens if a Rishon, so now that person who now has touched that Zav, who he himself is not a Zav, but now he's a Rishon Tumah, right? Let's say he goes and touches another person. Nothing. Min HaTorah, Tumah does not transfer to a person beyond a Rishon. You cannot have a human being who is a Sheni Min HaTorah.
Adam and Kalim.
Adam and Kalim, correct. Adam and Kalim cannot become a Sheni. The only thing that can become a Sheni, food and drink. Food and drink can become a Sheni.
And a Shlishi and a Revi.
And a Shlishi and a Revi under certain circumstances. So if it's chulin, meaning this, we're just having this for a cup of coffee. If I was a Rishon L'Tumah and I touch this food can become a Sheni L'Tumah. If I touch Binyamin, he cannot become a Sheni L'Tumah Min HaTorah. Now, let's say I was a Rishon L'Tumah and I touched this chulin, which became a Sheni L'Tumah, and you have a cup of coffee, and that cup of coffee happens to be Truma coffee. So that Truma coffee, only Truma and Hegdish, if this gets poured into it, now that's Tameh. Now your coffee is Tameh. Not just because there's...
Saying Shlishi only on Truma.
Shlishi is going to be on Truma and on Hegdish. And the Shlishi can only be Metama
And
Hegdish. So again, Av and Rishon is Adam and Kalim. Sheni is Ochlin and Mashkin only. Chulin, Hegdish or Truma. Shlishi is only Truma and Hegdish. Revi'i is only Hegdish.
I have a chart that, I need to see it.
Yeah.
I have a couple of charts.
Once you start wrapping, it actually is pretty logical. Once you realize that at each level, only one thing
What's
drops
the
off.
logic that Echel Mashma is more chomer than Kalim?
I don't know that. I think that's Exeris Akasa. I'm not 100% sure about that. Yeah. So now, again, so let's just quickly review it. Let's quickly review it. So we have Tuma transfers from one level to another. It goes Avi, Avosatuma, Avatuma, Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Revi. Now, at each level, it drops off in severity, and depending upon how holy the thing is, it's going to either be Metamed or not. So an Avi Avos, an Av will be able to be Metamed everything. A Rishon can be Metame only Ochlin or Mashkin, because again, it can become a Sheni, right? Once the Mashkin is a Sheni, it can be Metame only Truma and Hegdish. Once it's a Truma, once it's a Shlishi Latuma, it can only be Metame Hegdish. Meaning, if I have a Shlishi Latuma, that's Truma, and it touches other Truma, that Truma is fine. You cannot make that Truma a Revi, because remember, every time it touches. Kalim is really just vessels, but typically Kalim stops with humans. Humans and clothing go together.
Differentiate like we do with the Kalim Mikvah, but metal versus earthenware.
Mm-hmm.
It does.
There are some differences between earthenware, Kalim. Now, okay, everything I just discussed is Minatorah.
Right.
Midirabanan, it gets a little bit more, not complicated, but it breaks that structure I just described is really, really, once you think about it and look at it, it fits nice on a chart. Everything fits in its box. Midirabanan, under certain circumstances, the rabbis treated people, okay, as having a tumah midirabanan. So one classic example is touching Sefer Torah. Technically speaking, even if you're Torah, you just went to the mikveh, you're completely 100% Torah. Yeah, you brought your karbanos and everything like that. If you go touch a Sefer Torah midrabanan, you're tummy midrabanan, and not only are you, it's not that you're tummy midrabanan, your hands are tummy midrabanan. Min Torah, there's no such thing as being partially tummy. You're either all tummy or not tummy. The idea that the tumah stops at your wrist, Min Torah, does not exist. That is a creation of the rabbis. The rabbis came along and said, we are going to give you a status of tummy midrabanan up until your wrist for certain things. The two classic examples are the example I just gave, touching the cloth, the parchment of a Sefer Torah. The reason why they did that is they wanted us to not touch it. So therefore they said, we're going to sort of like punish you by giving you a status of Tamei Midrabanan when you touch it. And why do they want us touching parchment? Because it's very expensive. It's hard to make a Sefer Torah. Every time you touch it, it ruins it a little bit, and they don't want that happening. So therefore, that's why our minig is to use a talis when we're fixing the Hagba guys, because we're not supposed to really be touching the Sefer Torah. Another example that's discussed is, let's say, a perfect example, you have an avatum, let's say an azav. So Azav, who is an Avatuma, I touch Binyamin, and now Binyamin's a Rishon L'Tuma. If Binyamin now touches the rabbi Min Torah is nothing. Midrabanan, his hands, if he shook his hand, let's say, now the rabbi Midrabanan, his hands are Tamei Midrabanan, and he has to, how do you fix it? So how do you fix a Tuma? A Tuma that is a real Min Torah Tuma, there's really only one way. You got to go to the mikvah. Okay, you got to go to the mikvah. Under certain circumstances, you have to go into a spring. We won't go into that detail so much. And then if it's a Nitzora, Zav, and a couple of other ones, you actually have to bring a carbon, right? That's called Mechusar Kippur. We're not going to get into that now. We'll discuss that as we get to it. What's the only other piece that's relevant for our Gemara now is what I just discussed right now. The Tumah of the Rabbanon of your hands is called Tumas Yadayim. There's one other piece of Tumas Yadayim, which is the Midrabanan, the rabbis also made everybody Becheskas Tameh on their hands. When you wake up in the morning, you're tummy on your hand. When you go to sleep at night, you're tummy on your hands. That's a big part of the reason why we do Negelvasser. And the Svara is because Yadayim Askanio saying, literally it means our hands have a mind of their own, meaning we don't really know where our hands, it's like they're touching things. As we're moving throughout our day, where are we touching on our body, what we're touching, and therefore that's for sure the case, even during the day when we're walking around. So therefore, if a person hasn't been consciously watching his hands, the way we watch when you wash for bread, and then it's like, just make sure you don't touch anything between now and when you eat your bread, right? As long as people think you're not allowed to talk between washing and eating bread, it's actually a mistake. You're not allowed to talk between washing and making the bracha on the washing. That for sure you can't do. Once you've washed and made the bracha, really the only concern we have now is making sure your hands don't get tamei. Talking is irrelevant. The reason why talking is a problem is you start having a conversation, we're nervous, you'll get distracted in the conversation, and start, doing this, and then all of a sudden maybe you'll have to wash again. But if a person's very conscious of what they're doing with their hands, if they utter a word after they make down.
I'm going to say that clip because I've been doing it wrong.
Well, again, I'm not saying lechatchila you should talk. I'm just saying that if you talk, the idea of eating the washing, that's
not to talk.
Right, of course.
You definitely don't say a bracha. Don't watch it.
Just keep going because that happened yesterday.
Just go to the table and make hamotzi and eat. If you're talking between the bracha and the eating of the bread, or you're talking between the bracha and the washing of the hands, you got to do it again. Maybe not with the bracha.
So when can you talk in between going to washing?
No, after you make the bracha.
Once you've made the bracha on Netilas Yadayim. Now, I'm not suggesting talking. You shouldn't talk, but not because there's an issue to talk. It's because by talking you'll get distracted.
They'll talk about the bread or the salt.
That's why asking for the salt is okay.
But that's because it's in regards to the actual.
Yeah, because you're focused exactly on the thing. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying lechatchila go talk about the sports. If someone says, "Hey, I like the Jets," you're like, "Yeah." Like if your hands are good during that time and you said yes, you don't have to rewash. It's insane. But either way, so let's get back. So how do you become tahor? So if your whole body's tummy, you got to jump in a mikvah and maybe even go get a carbon. But if it's just a tumah derabanan, the way you fix it is by you need a revius on each hand. That removes it.
How much is a revius?
A revius has different opinions. It's really not that much. It's like 3, 4, or 5 ounces, depending upon your opinion.
You have to cover the whole. You have to get the water
over your whole hand, over the entire hand. You have to hold it up in the air. You want to make sure that the tumah from your body doesn't. It's complicated sugyas. But the point is that that's how you get rid of it, at least on a main level. And a better way to do it would be to literally take your hand and dunk it in a mikvah up to your wrist. Okay, and then perhaps under certain circumstances you'll need to even go your whole body into a mikvah. We'll see in a moment. That's in our Mishnah. Okay, one second. Let me just think. Okay, that's good. Okay, the last thing, the Yadayim Maskanio saying means that all of us are walking around with the Tumah Midrabanan on our hands. Okay, Now you might ask, well, once the rabbis made that true, then what was I saying before about the Sefer Torah? I mean, aren't they always going to be telling me midrabanan on my hands? So the truth is, yes, that's true. Meaning, it seems there really is no practical nafkamina in saying that the Sefer Torah touching its usher. It could be sequentially that happened first, and then they made the second takana, which just covered everything. But there are scenarios where you can have a nafkamina. Meaning, let's say a person went, washed, he's completely tahor, right now goes and touches the Sefer Torah, his hands just became tummy again, even though he hasn't scratched, even though he hasn't touched any other tumah. So there are scenarios where it's relevant. It's just, practically speaking, it's really not the relevant. We treat everyone as if they are tummy. Now, this is the next part is important. So what are my hands? Are they a nav? Are they a rishon? Are they a sheni? Are they a shlishi? Midrabanan, they're called a sheni. So even though, like I said before, if I am a rishon l'tumah and I touch the rabbi is now nothing because there's no such thing as a sheni l'tumah for a human. Midrabanan, if he shook his hand, his hands are a sheni l'tumah. Now, what does a sheni l'tumah have the ability to do? Not really much, right? Meaning it can't be matama people. It can't even be matama kalim. And even ochlin, right? It can't be matama chulin. Chulin, again, cannot become a shlishi. It stops at a sheni. So if his hands are a sheni and it touches chulin, no big deal. That's why, right. Now, some people, the prushim, they won't eat chulin unless it's tahar. Well, they can eat it. If you're a sheni l'tumah on your hands and you touch this food, it does not become tameh. Even the prushim would eat that. No problem.
It's only truma.
It can only be matama truma and kachin, which is why Kohanim have basically been the first of the OCD people in the world, because they were walking around constantly. Every time they had a hesach hadas, every time they forgot what they were doing for a minute, they became tameh, because the yadayim askani I was saying. Therefore, that's why they have to have a kior in every section of every part of the Beis Hamikdash. They constantly needed to wash feet, hands, the whole thing, because we didn't know, did they scratch, did they touch, where'd they go, what they do. So therefore, they were constantly becoming tameh. They needed to wash all the time. So therefore, Kohanim needed to wash before they touched anything food related, even if they weren't eating it, even if they were just preparing it, which again is going to give us a little bit of the beginning as to why we might do it before bread. But okay, so if the hands are a sheni, they can only make food tameh if it's truma or kachin. Right now, let's say I go and touch truma as a sheni l'tumah. I touch truma. What does the truma become? A shlishi. And if that truma gets mixed in with other truma, does that other truma become tameh? No, because a truma cannot become a revi. It can only become tameh if it touches hegdish, which is a revi. Okay, that hagdama, which, okay, not bad. It's recorded. We can review it again if you need to. It's a very yisaidistic hagdama, and we'll come back to a lot of these in Yonim as we go through the Gemara. The Mishnah is going to discuss here in the beginning of Ches Amud Beis 3 different areas where everything we're discussing is relevant. Says the Mishnah, Not liyadayim, the requirement to wash your hands, and here we're talking about what we do every morning, nagal or just means a revius on each hand. Not liyadayim lechulin, which, again, based on what I just said before, this should immediately be a question. What do you mean? Why do I need to wash my hands for chulin? I cannot be metameh chulin. L'maiser sheni, maiser here means maiser sheni, does not mean maiser rishon. Maiser rishon is entirely chulin. Maiser rishon is entirely chulin. It's given to the Leviim to eat. I mean, it's 100% theirs to do with whatever they want. Ula truma is already a step up. That makes sense because I need to wash before I touch truma. Ula kodesh, and I need to wash my hands before I touch hagdish. So the truma and the kodesh make a ton of sense. Even the maiser sheni makes some sense because it's on a higher madrega than chulin. The chulin is a little bit a question, and the Gemara will deal with this in a minute. Matbilin, however, being toivel my hands, right? So instead of washing them revius, but rather dipping them in a mikvah up to my wrist, that's required lechatas. Sorry, I read that wrong. Ulekodesh matbilin. If for hegdish, you have to stick your hand in a mikvah. It's not enough to just wash with a revius. Ulechatas, what's a chatas talking about? This is talking about the water that was mixed with the ash that was from the para aduma that would be used to help someone who is tamei meis become tahor. It was part of the tahara process, part of the purification process for such a person. That is a very holy level, right? Not something that the rest of us are typically touching, hopefully. But the container or whatever is the water, if someone's tamei, even a shnias liyadayim can make that tamei as well. It's no different than hegdish, right? So the halacha is, in order for you who have a tumah on your hands of this shnios, the rabbanon, in order for you to not be metame that mechatas, you have to, not enough to wash your hands. It's not enough to even dip your hands in a mikvah. For that, ulechatas im nitma'u yadav nitma gufa, meaning you have to entirely go into the mikvah. Your whole body has to go into the mikvah, no different than like a deraisa, if the way you became tameh was by touching. Remember, if it's just because Stam Yadayim Askanio saying, then it's no different than Hegdish, and all you got to do is stick it in a mikvah up to the wrist. But if it became Tameh, like by touching a Sefer Torah, or by having a Rishon Latuma touch you, then it becomes your entire body is Tameh, and therefore you now, at least as it comes to touching Mechatas, in order to touch it, you'd have to go into a mikvah. Okay, that's the end of the first part of the Mishnah. I know it seems like not a big payoff for all of the Hakdama, right? But it's 3 lines. But we're going to elaborate on these inyanim in the Gemara. The next step is talking now not about the tumah of yadayim. This is now talking about a tumah of the entire body. Says the Gemara, Tava lechulim. Let's say someone went to the mikvah, and when you went into the mikvah, you had intent to become tahor in order to touch chulin. Meaning, let's say you're a Prussian, or someone who only eats chulin if it's not tameh, and you went into the mikvah to make yourself tahor in order to eat your chulin. Huchzuk lechulin, his kavana works to help him eat chulin. Asr lamaser, but he's not allowed to eat maser. This is midarabanan. Minat Torah, if you drop into a mikvah, even if you're not even thinking, you can be thinking about the Yankee score, doesn't make a difference. If you fall into a mikvah and the mikvah's kosher, you're tahor. That's nothing to talk about Minat Torah. Midarabanan, they wanted you to have kavanah when you go into the mikvah. So therefore what they said was that whatever you have kavanah for, it'll work for. Whatever you don't have kavanah for, it will not work for if it's on a higher level of kedusha. So therefore, the person goes into the mikvah and he's thinking about, I'm going to go eat my chulin with this tahara process. He's allowed to eat chulin. Aser lamaser, meiser sheni. Tava lamaser, huchsuk lamaser, aser latruma. Tava latruma, huchsuk latruma, aser lakodesh. Meaning each one, it jumps up a level where you now can't eat the next thing. Tava lakodesh. Let's say I had a tefillah. I went in with the thought to be able to have hegdish. Huchsuk lakodesh, aser lachatas. I can't touch the chatas. I'm still tamei, midarabanan, obviously, for that. Tava lachamer, mutar lakal. It's just a generic statement. If you're tovel with the thought for the higher one, then of course you're covering everything else. So if I have kavana to eat hegdish, then I'm covered for truma, for chulin, and for the rest, for meiser sheni. Okay. Tovel v'lo huchzuk. Let's say you didn't have any kavana whatsoever while you're going in. Ki'ilu lo tovel midarabanan. Midaraisa, 100%, you're good to go. Midarabanan, you have to have kavana. That's the second part of the Mishnah. Third part of the Mishnah. What's an Amaretz? An Amaretz is not just simply someone who doesn't know what he's talking about. That is also part of the definition of an Amaretz. The other part of an Amaretz, it's really sort of a consequence of his lack of knowledge, is that because he doesn't know halacha, we generally assume he's not careful when it comes to things that requires knowledge. One area, exactly, that's exactly what the Mishnah Yomi is getting started with now. So an Amaretz is someone who not only does he not know something, but because he doesn't know things, therefore you can't really 100% trust. It would be like, imagine someone invited you over for a Shabbos meal, and you're thinking to yourself, wait, 1 second, I'm pretty sure his wife doesn't know her up from her down in terms of kashrus. And although they seem to be really nice, good from people, but I'm pretty sure she doesn't have a clue about bittul and lach and this. So unless there's someone in the house who knows halacha, you have to question. I mean, really, to be honest, can I trust the food in the house is going 100%? Again, we're not talking about someone's Yiras Shamayim here. We're talking about a lack of knowledge can lead towards, that's why you have a mashgiach who needs to know his stuff. He can't just be a guy who you pay him $11 an hour to go stare at a wall. He's got to know his halachos a little bit. Okay, so now that's the case. It's so too is the case by Tumah and Tara. So let's say you have someone who doesn't know the halachos of Tumah and Tara. His wife might be a nida. Let's say she lies down on a cushion, or she's using a blanket or something like that. Something that is kalim. That if she's a nida, she's an avatuma. She touches or sits on that blanket becomes tamei. Not only that. Interestingly, it's the one unique exception. Although I said it goes from an ab to a rishon to a sheni to a shlishi, there's something called tumas medris. Medris, it just comes from drisa, comes from stepping. It means any one of these avos tuma, as a certain group of them, that if they lean their weight entirely on it, they make the thing become an avatuma. So if a nida, a yoledes, I think a mitzvah is one of them also, but a nida, yoledes, a zav, and a zava are the 4 main ones, that if they sit on a cushion, they lie on a mattress, anything where they're putting their weight on it, the thing they're putting their weight on becomes tamei, and it doesn't become a rishon, it becomes an av. Medras means it's a horizontal move. There's no vertical drop, right?
There's this in touching. I'm saying
touching is just simply touching. Leaning or putting your weight on something, sitting on it would be a perfect example. It's called moshav, mishkav umoshav, lying and sitting. It's a specific. Okay, so now, if I have clothing that a nida wore, so clothing, when she sits down, if she's an actual nida, the clothing become an avatuma, right? Because again, that's tumas medris. So let's say I have an amaretz who's married, and his wife 2 weeks out of the month is a tamei, and 2 weeks out of the month she's not. Let's say, or maybe zava, whatever it is, And the clothes in his house, I have to assume, were worn by his wife who's a nida, and therefore it's tameh. And not only just regular tameh, that they're an avatumah. Yeah. So says the Mishnah, Big Day Am Haaretz, the clothing that belongs to an Am Haaretz, Medras Leprushin, meaning I'm someone who I want to eat chulin, and I want to eat chulin even though the chulin are tahor, but I want to be tahor while I'm eating it. So therefore, if I'm borrowing the clothing of my friend the Am Haaretz, I have to know that the clothing are becheskas avatuma.
Midrash for everyone.
They make me tameh, and it makes it tameh for everything. It's an avatuma.
But it's not midrash for Prushim. It's midrash for
Meaning,
everybody.
the point of the point in the Mishnah is that the level of shmira that we're going to be discussing as it goes up in stages is higher and higher. So the fact that the Am Haaretz doesn't have any shmira means that I have to assume his clothing has this level, and whatever the tumah is going to be, it'll be. Meaning, if it's an avatuma, therefore it's going to make my my food tummy, and therefore my chulin are going to become tummy, and I won't be able to eat it if I'm a Prushin, right? Big day Prushin, medras la'ochle truma, right? Meaning here, and again, this has nothing to do with Yiras Shamayim. And here it has nothing to do with even knowledge. The Prushim are assumed to know things. It's not even about the halachas. It's just about, imagine, they're not going to stop and think about the level of tumah required for a truma eater or a hegdish eater. Because again, remember, if I'm a Prushin and I'm only eating chulin b'tahara, I really don't care what happens to something after it's a sheni. Because I don't have to think about shlishi. I don't have to think about revi'i because I'm not eating truma and I'm not eating hegdish. So I don't even think about it. Once something's a sheni, I don't think about it anymore. I don't worry about what it touches. So now imagine I have a piece of clothing in my house that the woman is a nida, his wife's a nida. He lends it to his friend who is a kohen, who eats truma, right? So he thinks that this beged is tahor because for him it's tahor because for only things that matter to him, it's tahor. So let's say this is a keli that touched another keli. So it's a sheni latuma. So for him, he's good to go. But if he hands that over to a kohen, and that kohen now wants to go eat truma, well, when that kohen touches that beged, he becomes right. The clothing can make his food a shlish latuma, which for a kohen is a problem. So therefore, prushin is medrash laochle truma. And again, the point here is the level of shmira of a regular person is not enough for the kohen for truma. And as we'll see in a second, big day ochle truma is not enough. It's medrash lakodesh. The truma shmira is not enough to cover the hegdish eater, because again, that could become even a revi. So the whole point of this third part of the Mishnah is that we trust people in terms of their Yiras Shamayim, but in terms of just the human reality, that you're only going to watch for what you're concerned for. So if I'm going to be borrowing something from someone who doesn't watch it as well as I do, and someone's going to borrow something from me that needs a watch more than I watch, each one of us are going to have to be concerned that it's tameh, and therefore the person should be careful to not let it touch the food, or they shouldn't allow themselves to become that level of tumah, because they wouldn't be able to eat the truma or the hegdish in that state. And says the Bryce of Mishnah Weiter, Big Day Kodesh Medrash Lechatos, the last stage, which is if a person is going to be touching mechatos, or he's wearing clothing that's going to touch the mechatos, the clothing that comes even from a person who is a hegdish eater, which means he has all of the highest levels of shmira, still halachically we treat it. Now this is regardless of how, even if the guy's standing with someone next to him, says, make sure you don't let it go. No matter how much shmira, halachically the status as it goes from the prushin to the truma, from the truma to the hegdish, and the hegdish to the mechatos, halachically each status is defined in halacha that way. We can't change it. And as proof to that, the Mishnah says a story. Yosef ben Yoezer, he was one of the zugas, which we brought in the Mishnah earlier. Haya chassid shebekahuna. He was a very chashiv kayin, right? And he would eat truma b'tahara, always making sure, right? And afal piken v'haisam etpachtay medras lekodesh. His towel that he used to dry his beard and dry his hands with, that became tameh for the person eating hegdish. Why? Yosef ben Yoezer doesn't know the halachas. Of course he knows. He never learned this Mishnah. I mean, he doesn't know these halachas. Of course he knows these halachas. The teretz is halachically his shmira is not enough for those who eat hegdish. And the same thing is true as Yochanan ben Gudgada, haya ochel al taharas hakodesh kol yom. If he was a regular person, but he would only eat even chulin with the level of shmira that would be required for hegdish. It was a personal thing he did to be very frum. And afal pikein v'haisamak pachtei medrash lechatas. It didn't change anything. And the bottom line is, in the end of the day, touching the mechatas. It's a status change. It's not a svara that I watch what I do. Okay, so what did we say at the beginning of the Mishnah? The Mishnah said you wash hands for chulin and for meiser sheni. Asked the Gemara. The Gemara sort of now goes relatively quickly because we're holding by the end here. Chulin umeiser mi boy netilas yadayim. Who says you need to wash your hands to eat chulin and meiser sheni? Didn't we just say before that you cannot make chulin a sheni, meaning it can become a sheni, but it can't be matam anything else. So why would I need to wash my hands for it? Urimini, how could it say in the Mishnah that you need to wash? Urimini hatruma v'habikurim. This is a Mishnah bikurim. It says hatruma v'habikurim chayavin alei and misa. You chayav misa if you eat truma. Bikurim also, which is like a form of truma. All right. Now this misa here doesn't mean actual murder; it just means misa b'dei shemayim. V'chomesh, the halach is if you do b'shogeg, you have to pay back the amount that you sort of ate plus a fifth on top of that. The Asr Lazarim, which is obvious. If it's not Asr Lazarim, the first two things don't make sense. The Hey Nichse Kohen, once you give Truma and Bikurim to a Kohen, he can use it however he wants. If, let's say, he wants to take the money, he can use it to make Mekadosh Nisha, let's say. The Olin Be'echad Umeya, the halachas of Bittul, which are normally Batul Berov, majority make something nullified. With Truma, you need to have it as 100 to 1. It's a unique halacha in Truma. The Te'un and Netilas Yadayim, and here's the line that matters. They need washing of the hands specifically for this dindar abonon of shnios, our hands. V'heriv shemesh. Not only that, min haTorah, if the real is a real tuma, right, like an actual tuma, then it needs mikvah, and it's not enough to just start eating it during the day. You have to wait for the nighttime to come. Hare elu b'truma ubikurim masha'ein kain b'maser v'kol sheken b'chulin. Says the Mishnah, says the Brisa in Mishnah and Bikurim. Everything I just said is true for truma and not true for meiser and chulin. So you see mefurish in this Mishnah and Bikurim that meiser and chulin don't require netilas yadayim. One of the things mentioned. Gemara says kasha meiser, kasha chulin chulin. Gemara says like this: bishlam meiser like kasha. It's not difficult. You can explain the Mishnah and Bikurim in our Mishnah by meiser by saying harameir harabana, that one's rameir and one's rabbanon. How the Tanan, the Mishnah in Para says kol hataun bias mayim edivrei sofrim, anything that requires what do you call it? Going to the putting your hands in the mikvah, meaning washing your hands, midrabanan, which would include our case of yadayim, mitame es hakodesh uposel es hatruma umuter lechulin ulamaser. Divrei Meir. Reb Meir is the one who clearly holds that you don't have to wash your hands, and so therefore he's like the Mishnah in Bikurim that says you don't need to wash your hands. The Chachamim oisrim maser, but by Meiser the Chachamim say you do. So you could say that our Mishnah is the Chachamim. However, so that will explain the Meiser stira. Lechulin achulin kasha. You still have a problem. The our Mishnah and the Mishnah Bikurim for chulin. So Gemara says like kasha. Kan be'achila, kan be'negia. Our Mishnah is talking about you need to wash in order to eat, whereas the Mishnah Bikurim is talking about needing to wash in order to touch. In order to touch, there you don't need to wash. But if you want to eat it, now you're going to have to wash, right? So says the Gemara. 1 second, that can't be. Their whole entire machlokes is eating of meiser. So you can't explain our Mishnah of chulin. It'll only be able to explain that our Mishnah is going to be talking about achila of meiser. But chulin, why do you need to wash? Even the Chachamim are not going to hold you need to wash for eating chulin. Even the Chachamim, they're only saying it by meiser. Right? Because we're right. Everyone agrees you don't need to wash. So how could it be that our Mishnah says you need to wash for chulin? So Gemara says, you're right. The Mishnah in Bikurim and the Mishnah here is all talking about achila. It's just that they're talking about achila of different things. Like kasha, kan ba'achila the nahama, v'kan ba'achila the peri. Our Mishnah is talking about eating bread, and in talking about eating bread, you need to wash even for chulin. Whereas achila de peri, meaning anything not bread, you don't need to wash. Unless, and that's the tali in the machlokes Reb Meir and the Chachamim. The Amar of Nachman. Reb Nachman had said, "Kol hanotel yod of lepeiros." Anyone who washes their hands for peiros, meaning not bread, harezu migasi aruach. Since halachically you don't need to do it, it's considered a balgaiva to do it. So therefore, our Gemara is explaining that our Mishnah requiring netilas yadayim is only talking about netilas yadayim for bread. Now, the question is, why do we wash for bread? I mean, we're not kohanim, right? And since we said before that our hands are Yadayim Askanio saying we're Shniyam Latuma, and we said a Sheni cannot make chulin, a shlishi. Chulin cannot become a shlishi. So why do we even wash before we eat bread? What's that?
We just been saying I'm the
So I'm asking why. I mean, what?
Okay.
Right? And even over here, Yeah. So the shaila, why in svara do we have to wash for bread?
Why is bread worse than
Meaning,
fruit?
why bread worth than fruit, and why is it? And really, it should be for negia. So it says like this: since Kohanim needed to wash their hands before they even touched food, any type of food, right? Because for them, if it was truma, it would become tameh. We, in order to be margil the Kohanim in their act of washing, we wash ourselves. Now, once we did that, you might say, so then why don't we wash for all foods, even before eating it, even just touching it? Before I touch any food, I should have to wash my hands. So on that, the Chazal understood that it'll only be for eating, and even there, they said only for that when you're a kaveh suda. So when you're kaveh suda on bread, you have to wash, but when you're not being kaveh suda, you wouldn't have to wash, which would be all in order to help the Kohanim. So it's amazing. The Kohanim only are washing because Midrabanan there's a shniel tuma that their hands are considered tameh. To begin with, the whole thing's only the Rabbana. And not only that, it's just their hands. We, who are not Kohanim, unless someone here is a Kohen, right, or a Levi even, we don't have to, we're not allowed to eat Truma, so we don't have to worry about our hands. But in order to keep the Kohanim washing their hands, we have to wash our hands. And we don't even wash for everything. We just wash for that we're Kovei Sudan, which is bread, which is why we do it. But it's funny, all of the halachos of how we wash are learned from the halachos of how a Kohen washes for his Truma.
Very good. Good.
Okay, that was the beginning of
Okay,
Tumah Tara.
anybody have a chance to stop breakfast and stop breakfast?